welcome everyone. In case, a couple of people might have missed, so I'm Rose McGeown. I'm one of the educational psychologists in WAAS, and today's workshop is around talking with your child about their autism diagnosis. Okay, so today what we're going to be discussing is, when is the right time to share information about your child having the autism diagnosis or maybe undergoing some of the assessments. We're going to be thinking about taking your child's lead, so kind of noticing signs when it might be a good time to share information about their diagnosis. Thinking about what should you say. So this is a question we get asked a lot. Just how do I tell my child, or what's the language I should use? What are some of the words I should use? So we'll have a discussion about that. What to do if your child feels anxious or upset. So for some children, they might have some anxiety, or they might have some worries about what this all means. I mean, for most of them, I'm going to be honest, they don't. And actually, knowing that they have the diagnosis kind of suddenly makes sense to them, or why they might have felt a little bit different, or why they experience the world in a certain way. So on the whole, it's actually a very positive process, but just being mindful if your child is anxious or upset, what kind of things that we should say or do. I'm going to try and share some helpful resources, so kind of activities you could do or books that you could look at with your child. And I wanted to share a little bit of information about talking to siblings. And we can also have a discussion if you want after about any other family relatives as well. So just thinking about the kind of information we want to share with other people in the family and kind of tailoring it to them. And then finally, Charlotte and I can kind of just share some information about what else is available in Wandsworth more generally for your families. So in terms of the right time, there isn't really a specific time that I can actually give you, because ultimately this is, your decision, and I can't say for everyone that there's going to be, a perfect time and a specific time for you to do this. But there are some kind of general rules and some general understanding about these conversations. So on the whole, we would say to try and share information about your child's diagnosis of autism earlier rather than later. And the reason we say this is because it helps them to develop an understanding of their self. So we do sometimes work with some slightly older children who perhaps are only finding out about their diagnosis much, much later, and they then have to kind of almost redefine who they are as a person, or look back and realize, oh, okay, these are the reasons why I was always struggling with those particular things. Whereas we find for the younger ones, actually, it's part of their identity, and they also can get support much earlier and kind of can access it more easily. So we on the whole, we say earlier is generally better, but of course everybody is different, and for some children maybe they just aren't ready to have this conversation, or can't access some of the information. So we really need to be aware that it's a really individual decision. But we would say to consider your child's individual needs. So really thinking about their age and their developmental stage, and things like, their language skills, how motivated perhaps they are about finding information out as well. And when we share the information, we might tailor it as well, again, to their age and developmental stage. So is it that they just need to know a little bit of information, or if they're much older, do we want to go into much more detail and talk about, brain differences in a more scientific way? Or if they're younger, do we just want to use a few simple pictures? We're going to really have to differentiate depending on the individual child. Some children will naturally start to ask questions, and I think it sounded like some of you had a recent diagnosis or were going through that stage now. And that tends to be a time where we'll notice children are asking questions because they're wondering why they're going to various appointments, and maybe they're wondering why they always come out, out of lesson to interventions. They might ask questions about perhaps differences between them and their peers. So those kind of questions can be signs that they're curious. They want to know, what is it that's making them different from their peers or from others at school. And they tend to be a good starting point, actually, to having some of these conversations and kind of using their questions to start to provide some answers. But we would say, in terms of the timings, to choose calm times. So not to kind of drop this information in, the middle of a time where they're really stressed or they're really, really upset about something, kind of, dropping a bit of a bombshell, loads of information all at once. It's really hard for children to process information that way, but it also doesn't really set the tone of, future conversations. We don't want it to be a huge, massive conversation. We'd rather it just be like a trickle of information gradually so that they can start to learn more and more about what is autism, what it means for them. So we want it kind of in calm times, over time, ideally without interruption. So kind of having like a safe space or a fun time at home. Maybe you're doing an activity together and you can start to open up that conversation. Some parents and carers can feel a bit nervous about sharing the information, and we do find sometimes that it might be because they themselves are not feeling completely confident about what is autism. So in that scenario, we would normally say it would be really, really helpful for you as parents or carers to attend an autism course first, just so you feel really confident in understanding what it is before you have to share the information to your child. So there are courses run in Wandsworth by a charity called Contact. So Charlotte and I can share information at the end about that a little bit more, but it's a 6-week course, and sometimes it's a little bit longer, where they'll share lots of information about what is autism. So hopefully by the end of that course, you yourself will feel, okay, I've got a really, really good understanding, and now I can kind of pass on some of that information to my child. So it's a really good place to start. And obviously reading books and maybe watching some YouTube videos or listen to podcasts, anything to kind of build your own confidence and your own ideas about what autism is. Okay, so in terms of taking your child's lead, I kind of already mentioned this, but it really is about when your child is showing signs of being quite curious or wondering about what's the difference between them and their peers, or just asking questions about maybe why they find things easy, why they find things difficult, why they don't like some things or do like particular things, it's a really helpful time to start to share some of this information. And I would say when they do start to ask those questions, to kind of make the most of that opportunity rather than maybe trying to dismiss maybe some of the differences. Differences is absolutely not a bad thing at all. We really want to kind of celebrate those differences, but also acknowledge them. So kind of acknowledging them and then start to build a bit of knowledge and awareness around autism. So in terms of what to say, I think this is where lots of parents and carers seem to be a bit nervous, I guess, about saying the right thing or the wrong thing. And I think Charlotte made a really good point at the beginning of, please don't think you've got one opportunity to do like the perfect speech about autism and that's your only opportunity, because we would really encourage you to just have small steps over time. So giving a bit of information and building on it over time, rather than just having one big sit down conversation, saying everything there is to autism and that be the end of it. So in that respect, you've got loads of opportunities to kind of, if you feel like you didn't do a good job the first time, you didn't quite explain it as well as you hoped you had, next time you can kind of build on that. So please don't feel bad or feel like you've made the wrong decision or given the wrong information, because it definitely is a process, and I'm sure we've all said things we didn't quite mean before or haven't quite articulated it exactly as we meant. But as I said, the information itself needs to be adapted to the age and level of understanding of the child. So we'd really encourage you, if they're young ones, like it sounds like a few of them today, your children are quite young, is to make it kind of really pictorial, maybe really fun, having just conversations about individual differences, things that mummy likes, things that daddy likes, things that they like, things that maybe they find that they're really good at, and then things that they're not so good at, and just kind of noticing patterns is a nice place to start for the young ones. For the older ones, you can kind of start to add a lot more information, perhaps more quickly, and for particularly much older ones, we do find some of them really love to go into great detail. You know, what is it about the brain that they can understand? Can they research this in more of their own time? So really needing to adapt it depending on their age. But we always say the best place to start is really think of trying to normalize this idea of differences, because we all have differences. We all have things that we're good at. We all have things that we're not so good at. We have different preferences. You know, we all look different. So it can be a really helpful place to start is just to even think about within your family. What are all the differences and similarities between everyone in your family, or it could be family friends or some of your child's friends, and just kind of considering then what are the strengths, what things they're not good, maybe not so good at or need a bit more help with, and noticing patterns. So what we eventually want to work up to is kind of pointing out or supporting your child to kind of notice that there is a pattern in things that they find tricky. And in that pattern, basically, we call that autism. So having specific things that they are good at and some things that they really struggle with, that has a name, and that's autism. So we're looking out for, you know, kind of difficulties with social interaction or social communication. Maybe they've noticed some sensory sensitivities, and kind of bringing that all together, that has got a name. So kind of not making a really big deal out of it, but just pointing out that there are quite a few people in the world, and maybe even in their school actually, that kind of might have a similar pattern of things that they're good at and things that they struggle with a little bit more. And then I would really encourage you to introduce the terminology autism, just kind of using that word and kind of making it part of the everyday vocabulary. So not kind of, yeah, shying away from it. And maybe we do notice that some people might use like alternative things, but actually it's helpful just to use the term autism. You might notice that when your child is diagnosed, the health clinicians tend to use the term which comes from the diagnostic manual. So they tend to use the term autism spectrum disorder. But we in WAAS and lots of other professionals kind of have a bit of you know, we try not to use that terminology essentially, because we're trying not to associate autism with the idea of it being a disorder. We're trying to instead adopt a more neuro diverse kind of celebration kind of stance, where we're thinking about it being a brain difference as opposed to a disorder. So we use the term autism spectrum condition, but you could also use the term just autism. That's what I tend to use because it's much, you know, it's really clear, it's just one word, and then there's no kind of connotations to it either way. But just being aware that if you do look at the literature, you will see lots of different words being used to describe the same thing. And also you'll see ASD, ASC, autistic, Asperger's. So just picking a word that you are comfortable with using and kind of sticking with that, and just starting to introduce that to your everyday within your everyday conversations, I think is really, really helpful. And the biggest piece of advice I would say is just to keep these conversations and the discussions about autism as positive as you can, because your child is going to take the lead from you. So if you're feeling quite nervous about it, or maybe you are kind of always focusing on the areas of difficulty with your child is going to associate, therefore autism is kind of more around the idea of it being a really big difficulty, and there's lots of negative connotations. So what we really want to do is either present it neutrally, like a neutral, this is just some information about yourself, as much as it is, you know, I don't know, you're like British and you speak English, you also are autistic. Or you might want to actively present this as a positive thing about them, you know, almost something that's giving them a bit of a difference. That's a really positive thing. And there are, of course, there are areas that they're going to struggle with, but there are people out there who are going to support them. So making it a really nice, positive, supportive conversation. And we do notice that children we meet, Charlotte and I, all the time, we can kind of almost tell, I guess, in some ways, how the autism diagnosis has been presented to them, because they will then share their views of kind of the information that they've been given. So if we can give it as positively as possible, they will develop a really, or hopefully a kind of positive sense of self, and just see it as part of their identity and nothing that they feel kind of particularly nervous about or worried about. But I will come on to, because they can obviously sometimes with new information, it can be interpreted as a bit of a concern. So I'll come on to that. And finally, I wanted to say to give your child opportunities to ask questions. So with anything, if we give loads of information, normally even more questions then have been generated, even though we've tried to answer all the questions. And just therefore giving your child opportunities to ask them, even if they seem a bit silly. Or sometimes some of the children don't have any questions at all, and parents are almost a bit like, oh, I just tried have been thinking about this for months and months. I've been on the parenting course. I've been really carefully thinking about what I'm going to say, and then the child is almost doesn't even acknowledge what was said. And just knowing that that information will have gone in somewhere, but maybe they just need some time to process that, and then you might find in a few days' time they've got some questions, or even if then they don't, it will just be about gradually kind of continuing those conversations in the future.